Azure data platform technologies for a little while now, and did consulting for several years before I was at Databricks. And so happy to be sharing with you a bit about, like, I kind of put three of my favorite topics together, and I think that we can kind of take some questions across them as I go through the prepared material and demos. So we'll be talking about how do we take work that we want to run on Databricks and automate it through workflows. How do we actually automate the deployment of those workflows and getting those resources deployed out to our Databricks workspace, and then a bit about testing, which really just kind of fits into that whole flow when we're trying to follow software development best practices. Okay, so essentially the order we're going to go through, and then we will do demos about halfway, and then towards the end we can kind of stick on the demo side and see what questions we have, especially then. We're going to talk about the CICD best practices, just kind of high level, make sure we're on the same page there. Talk about Databricks workflows, what capabilities they provide and how they're useful. Talk about Databricks asset bundles, which is the way I would recommend that we automate the deployment of workflows and the movement of our code from our repositories into our Databricks workspace, as well as we'll talk about testing and automation. I'm going to use GitHub Actions as an example. If you're using something else, such as Azure DevOps, a lot of these things look very similar, except the actual YAML code for the deployment would look a little different in Azure DevOps than what I'll show today. So with that, let's jump into CI/CD practices. Why is CI/CD important? CI/CD is the continuous integration, continuous deployment of our software applications and the related libraries and code. So CI/CD is important because it ensures best practices and an easy release of new features. So we want to make sure that we have our code that we're developing under version control so that we know what has changed. We can roll back if we need to. We can merge code changes from different developers that are on the same team or across the organization together. We want to make sure we have automated tests so that we don't have. I used to live in this space where every Thursday night or something, the DBAs would deploy all of our Microsoft SSIS code, which is a way of writing ETL. At least it was for a while. It's still kind of out there. And when they did that, they'd follow these steps we wrote down for them. And it was a very kind of scary evening because if we got the steps wrong, if we forgot a schema change, we would then have to be on call to fix it, sometimes in the middle of the night when it broke halfway through the nightly run. So we're trying to avoid that, right? And we also want to make sure that that deployment doesn't have all these manual steps so that there's not a mistake on the deployment or a mistake in the code because it's all been tested throughout different environments before they go to production. And then through these types of capabilities, we expect to have faster innovation. If there's a bug that needs fixed or a new feature that is really important, we're able to get that done and tested and pushed out the door much quicker than waiting for like this big monthly release. Sometimes there's other reasons why we release in these large batches each month, but this allows us to release much more often if we choose to. Okay, so I talked about continuous integration. Continuous deployment is kind of the theme of this CI/CD concept. When we talk about continuous integration, the main thing I would focus on is we're really talking about the development of the code, getting that code into source control or version control, which is what GitHub, Azure DevOps, a variety of other types of tools where we commit code, what those do for us. We want to be able to run automated tests, the continuous integration sort of pre-deployment. Before we start moving this into our real test environments, let's have some amount of testing. And a lot of these tests can actually run during the development cycle too. And then we want to build artifacts that can be deployed. So a lot of times we're kind of packaging up our code. With Databricks, with some other data systems, you don't necessarily need to package the code you would if you wrote compiled code like Scala and Java, C++, etc. But you still might do this. You still might store it all into some versioned folder or versioned zipped file in order to make sure that you know what all was deployed together as a single version. When we talk about continuous deployment, we're really talking about the next steps where we deploy that code that's been packaged up as an artifact, deploy that to staging or testing, depending on what terms you like to use, deploy it to production environments. We want to be able to run some integration and system tests. A lot of times we have unit tests that run much earlier on in the cycle, and we don't really need to run those again if we're pushing the same code to another environment. But we definitely want some integration and system tests as we go into staging to make sure everything is working in a more fully deployed environment, which should be very close to what production environment will look like. We want to schedule automated runs, and we want to be able to reinstall the code and restart any like streaming jobs. That's kind of a final step, especially in data workloads where you have these jobs that might run for a really long time. You need to think about what happens with those when you deploy the latest and greatest version of code to production. So borrowing a slide from the team at Databricks that's put together a great workshop about this. When we look at this flow kind of visually, we've got the developer on the far left here is working with their code from GitHub or some other version control system. They pull down a certain branch of code, is the term we use for the kind of isolated directories of code we've got, isolated versions of code, going to kind of spin off their own feature branch, make some changes, and then push that back out to the version control system. Within Databricks, I'll show you a glimpse in the demo of how we can actually connect directly to that version control system. So whether you're working on your local laptop, like I will for a little bit of my demos, whether you're working in the Databricks UI, just the web UI, like I will for part of my demos, you can still interact with that same version control. Now, as we get into continuous integration is when we have some sort of automated run of unit tests, potentially some integration tests as well, peer review of the code to merge it into a specific branch where we put all of the code that's ready to go to test or staging environments. So then right in the middle of the screen here, we've got it going to a bunch more automated testing running in that kind of QA staging workspace. And then if that all passes, we would have a kind of a final peer review. Usually that's just making sure what those tests say worked is sufficient. All the approvals are checked if there's any other internal processes. And we merge that into like a main branch, which then deploys all the way to production. Potentially there's some tagging and some other Git practices. But the high level concept I'm hoping we're all on the same page of is do development, save our changes, merge those together with some peer review to make sure we don't have one developer making a change without the team being aware and on board that it's following any sort of coding best practices and testing best practices, getting that automatically pushed out to production, even if there's a little bit of, approval checks along the way to make sure that anyone that needs to say, yes, this is ready to go to the next environment has a chance to approve or check those boxes. So that is my CICD overview intro. Any questions yet on that concept? Okay.
We do have a question on the chat.
Yeah. What all languages do we generally use with CI/CD workflow? So the tests are going to be likely written in the language. There are some specialty tools that I don't know much about. Tests are typically written in the language that the code itself is written in. So working with Databricks, a lot of Databricks developers are using Python. Quite a few are also using Scala or Java, though there's other options like R and just straight SQL that you can use. And so testing often is written in Python or Scala, depending on what your code is written in. The scripts to actually do the deployment could be a combination. Usually there's some YAML files. It's a certain file format we'll see a glimpse of that your whatever CI tool you use, like GitHub Actions is what I'll show today, understands and then runs all those steps from the YAML file. However, you may also have like shell scripting bash commands in there that are setting up, basically making command line calls from whatever CI runner you have, whatever machine is running this automated deployment. Definitely follow up with more specific questions in a bit here if what I show you doesn't clarify what you're after there. Okay, so let's talk about workflows. Workflows aren't necessarily tied to CI/CD. Workflows are tied to automating Spark code and automating Databricks code and automating different tasks on Databricks. So why do we want to use Databricks workflows? Because I don't want to have to go in and click run on a notebook or submit a Python script manually all the time. There are some different options, but essentially workflows let us set up automated jobs that support complex dependencies. So rather than have some other code that I use, some other orchestrator I use outside of Databricks, I can actually set up all the dependencies together with the logic that's built into Databricks workflows. So these can be scheduled. They can be triggered by a file arrival, or you could just make an API call that kicks off a Databricks workflow. The word Databricks workflow and Databricks job is essentially synonymous. When I say workflow, though, just think that it's not running a single notebook necessarily. It can be much more than that. In these workflows, then we have a set of tasks that need to run with any dependencies that exist among them. And then we have a variety of task types, which I'll actually show you the screenshot of those instead of talking about them here. So just to show, still not a complex example, but just to get some visual as to what this looks like, I can go into the web UI and define a Databricks workflow. I can choose different tasks that run different types of files. I have one that's running a notebook. In this case, it's a PySpark notebook. I have one that's running just a Python file that has been put into my Databricks workspace. In this case, it's coming directly from a GitHub repo. And then I have a SQL statement that exists in my workspace that's being pointed to run on a Databricks SQL warehouse. And so you can see that it kind of, after the first task, it splits into two. There's quite a bit more you can do here. There's logic like, run if everything's completed, run if nothing failed. There's additional like alerts and retries and things that you can set with Databricks workflows. So I am going to jump into the UI pretty soon here to make sure you have a chance to kind of see it, and you can ask questions then about does it do this one specific thing. And this is just the full list of task types that you should see if you have an Azure Databricks account and open up workflows right now. So we've got notebooks and Python scripts. Python wheels are like a packaged version of Python code. So you take all that code and package it up, and you can run, you can have different entry points that you run from that wheel. You can run SQL code, Delta Live Tables pipelines. That's our declarative ETL capability. So it's scripted, but it's a kind of a special scripting language that works within Databricks. DBT, which is a way of doing ELT type workloads with SQL. Jars, Spark submission, running other jobs. You can have sub jobs that are defined as these workflows, and then you kick them off from this one. And then if else conditions to really get a little bit more clever with your logic to kind of split your path depending on what happens on the prior steps. Okay, so once we've picked different tasks of different types, or as we're defining each task, we have this choice for most task types to choose a repository, any kind of Git repository. Well, there's a list of about 7 providers that are supported. Azure DevOps and GitHub are probably the most relevant to those that are used to working with an Azure platform. So you set that up. You may have to use credentials if it's not a public repository. You pick the branch that you want this workflow to be tied to, and that will essentially clone and run your code directly from your GitHub rather than you having to publish it out to your Databricks workspace. I will try to cover why we might do it this way versus another way I'll show you with Databricks asset bundles. It's a decision that teams have to make, and you might choose different things in different scenarios. When it comes to triggers, the main triggers that are built in right now are the ability to have a schedule, and that's probably what you would expect. You can pick days, hours, etc., and have that run at a certain interval and a certain number of days, etc. Then we have trigger type, which is going to be when a file arrives in a location, go ahead and kick off this job. And you can do some things like say, but hey, make sure there's at least 5 minutes between runs. Give it a little time because I know multiple files get written within a matter of minutes. A few little settings there, but essentially as files arrive, it will kick off the job for you. And then the other one that I don't have a special picture for is continuous. If I have like a streaming job that needs to just always be running, and if it stops, I need it to just kick off again and keep working, that would be continuous. So a lot of times Spark structured streaming or some types of streaming Delta Live Table pipelines are scheduled as continuous. That's a good topic, by the way, the different triggers to, and really just workflow features in general to keep an eye out at Databricks Data and AI Summit, which is coming up in June. I will be there in person. If anyone else from this group is going to make it, hit me up on LinkedIn and happy to chat at some point. But Databricks Data and AI Summit is going to be, making some different announcements, and I expect there's some good workflow announcements coming at that time. Okay, so let me awkwardly switch over to Chrome so that we can do a little bit of demo here. What I want to show you first is that one. Okay, you should be seeing my Chrome browser. Can anyone confirm that for me? All right, if you're still seeing slides, let me know in the next minute here. So Essentially, what I've got going on, let's start with the whole idea of version control and how that ties into automation, is I've got my GitHub environment, and this is actually a public repo that you're welcome to go to. Let me throw that in chat, by the way. I'll give it to you at the end, but might as well make sure if anyone wants to stop listening and start browsing on their own and start setting this all up, you can. What I have is I have a bunch of work I've been doing on a feature branch called monorepo, and I want to actually merge that to main, which would kick off my deployment to, in this case, my staging environment. And so from my version control, I can do things like create what's called a pull request, where I compare code, do some approvals. I won't go in detail here because many of you have probably worked with this type of thing a bit by now. But as I go about, probably giving a good description about what all these changes are, I can create the pull request. Usually someone else that's not the developer would come in, take a look at all of the file changes that have happened, probably go through pretty much line by line and make sure everything is what was asked for, everything is following best practices. You might have some automated tools even here to check that code is good and that kind of thing. So I don't have any special rules that are going to run tests and have to pass before I can go ahead and merge. So I'm going to go straight to a merge to main. I'm going to let it have all of these fun messages in there. And then with this merge to main, because I've got full example demo CICD set up, this merge to main should have just kicked off what's called a GitHub action to start deploying this in the background. So let's check on if that's actually working real quick, and then we'll let it run for a bit. It'll probably finish before we're done, or it'll fail very quickly. Either one will not surprise me, which is, okay, that's how demos go. So yes, there's something happening here. This is it's really my CI and my release all together in a single workflow. And so that is processing right now. And we'll dig into those details after I talk more about the concepts that go into it. So for those that are interested in workflows, what we can do is jump into what that looks like from the UI before I show you how we define those to be a part of our CI, a part of our version control, and something that we can automate and deploy. Was there a question? Okay. I see the question that notebooks, are they Jupyter notebooks? They're not exactly Jupyter. We're using Databricks notebooks here, which I think if you look hard, you'll find what they're originally kind of forked from or based off of, but they're Databricks notebooks that work a lot like Jupyter notebooks. You will see though that I have IPython notebooks is something I use quite a bit. That's one of the options besides kind of the native Databricks notebooks. And I use those because I like to work out of Visual Studio Code as well. And we will touch that topic before long. Yeah, we're doing good. Okay. Any other questions yet? All right. Yeah. Feel free to keep putting them in the chat, but I don't mind people speaking up either. So, all right. So here I am. I'm inside a repository. This is a repo folder where I've set up the ability to connect to that same GitHub repository. I can switch between branches. As I make changes, I'm actually going to be able to commit that code directly from here. And so really the way I expect to develop from the workspace and be able to work together with others that are developing from a local IDE like VS Code is through version control, through pushes and pulls and that kind of thing, which is a normal software development flow. As a data engineer, I learned that a little later in my career than most software developers learned, but I think it's probably gained a lot in popularity amongst data engineers and even data scientists by now. So jumping over to workflows, this is my repository, which we'll do some things with as we go. If I jump over to workflows, I can see that I've got a few workflows defined. Most of these have been deployed via automation. One of them is actually being run right now to do some validation of what's going on. So let's go ahead and look at an example that I think might actually be good to add to our automation soon. I don't know if I'll do that live in this session, but let's at least start the process. So I have a workflow. It has not run yet, so it may not actually work. But if I jump over to my tasks, I can see that I've got a single task. As I look through, remember I showed those types in my screenshot. I can choose my type here. I'm working with a notebook. I've given it a path inside my version control. You don't have to. I could point to a workspace location, which is how probably most people who've worked with Databricks workflows have done this in the past. Perfectly fine to do either. The main point is to make sure that you know which version of code you're going to run as part of your workflow. If you're going to be doing this automated deploy, like I highly suggest you do. The job cluster is defined, so it's going to spin up a cluster just for this workflow. That can be reused across different tasks within the same workflow, which is a very important thing to know if you're trying to control cost and not have extra time for each cluster spinning up for each task. So I set up a cluster that I would reuse if I had multiple tasks, but I can choose additional clusters if I need to isolate more, okay? You can define library dependencies. There's a few ways to do that, but one of them is to actually just define them right here in the workflow. And then here's where I can set up retries. I can have it notify me. Easiest way is just email me if it succeeds, email me if it fails, and that sort of thing. When it comes time to run it, obviously, I can just run now. There's a big blue button that makes that very clear. I can also add a trigger. I kind of showed that UI already, but this is where you would go to get to those options I displayed. And then once it runs, we won't spend a lot of time on the monitoring of it, but once it runs, I can go to kind of the view run page. A few ways to get there, of course, but if I jump here, it's going to start up a cluster, probably take about 3 minutes here, and start running and show some of the output of what's going on with that notebook. The other thing I can do, if I ignore that for a bit and come back, is if I'm working out of GitHub, I can look over here to jump to where that code actually exists that I'm working with, right? Okay. More importantly is if I want to add this to my automation, and I've already built it in the UI because I'm the most comfortable with that. I like having the drop-down boxes and to make sure I get all these parameters and settings correct. I can click on this action button, these 3 dots here, and I can say view YAML or JSON, and I can go ahead and copy that YAML. And that'll get added, that can be added to my Databricks asset bundles as another resource to deploy next time I commit and run this automated deployment. Okay, questions on that? Or now is also a good time to say, hey, would I use workflows for this use case or for this scenario? Any questions?
We do have a question on the chat.
I answered the Jupyter Notebooks one. Is there another one that came through?
Yes, right below.
Oh, okay.
So what do you think about the following DevOps? Yeah.
So the question is, what do you think about the following DevOps workflow for Databricks? Configure Git repos for your Databricks project files. Okay. Create your build pipeline to copy all your Git-based code using publish pipeline artifact. Okay, that is, I think that's that's an Azure DevOps task that I think puts your artifacts somewhere that can then be pulled later. Then it basically creates a build, right? A build type of package, and then you would release and deploy the build. Oh, this is getting a little more, I haven't used Azure DevOps in like 2 years, I'm sorry. So I think we're getting a little too in the weeds in this question beyond what I'll answer. Why don't I show you the GitHub action soon after I explain what's going to happen inside of it? And then maybe you can bring up what's different about my steps versus what you did here. So I will say this, the idea of moving your code, including your notebook code, to a specific, deploying it to a specific location in your workspace rather than pointing directly to a branch of your Git repo, that is, I'd say, it's a good debate to have. It's a good discussion to have, both have it, within your team, within your group of people that share the environment, and make sure you agree. But it's a nice one to talk about with other people that are using Databricks. And so there's some pros and cons there, which might kind of play into why you might package up and deploy with Azure DevOps as well. Question about, is this the Databricks Community Edition? I think they're basically saying, hey, can we do this for free? This is not Databricks Community Edition. I've got quite a bit of stuff going on in this environment, some of it probably isn't covered by Databricks Community Edition. How about this? If the fearless leaders of the group will remind me right after Data and AI Summit, I'd be happy to write up and send something out about new options people can try for running Databricks for free, or that kind of thing. You can run, to get all the features, you can run Azure Databricks trial. It creates a trial workspace that exists for a certain amount of time. It might be 14 days still. Just keep in mind that if you do that type of trial where you get the full features, anytime you're doing compute like I'm doing, that's going to spin up Azure virtual machines behind the scenes. You will pay for those virtual machines, so you just won't pay for the Databricks cost. Right, okay. And then there's a hand raised. Did someone want to ask a question verbally here?
Yes, I did. Hey, Dustin, nice to meet you virtually. I was wondering if these, the CICD workflows through Databricks, can they handle like environmental deployments as well, like something like an ARM template? Deploys in QA or something, or automatically as well, or will we still need to kind of play around?
You can mix those types of things. Like I'll call it like infrastructure or maybe additional resources, not our artifacts that are part of Databricks jobs, but other resources. You can mix those in the same deployment. It's not really a Databricks thing. It's can GitHub Actions handle it? And I think it can. Can Azure DevOps handle it? Yes, for sure. Whether or not you do put those in the same deployment process is a different conversation. And so typically let me talk from like a little bit more Databricks focus, but bringing that in. If I'm going to deploy, a lot of times we use Terraform in with the customers I talk to, but let's say I'm using Terraform or ARM templates to deploy a bunch of networking, some storage, Azure storage locations, deploy a Databricks workspace, set up Unity catalog, maybe even grant some permissions and set up schemas. All of that still could be split, but I consider that more of an infrastructure thing that probably doesn't need to happen every time I deploy the code. When I make changes to my code and to my job logic, I probably want to deploy that independent of those other steps.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Gotcha. Cool, thank you.
So yeah, most things that you can do from a command line, really anything you can figure out how to do from GitHub runners, from Azure DevOps, from GitLabs, like you can mix that in here. Does it make sense to is kind of the other side of it. So yeah. All right, let's keep on moving. I think we're doing pretty good on time. We'll have some more time to kind of come back to this topic as well. So I did not try and show you the most impressive, crazy stuff we can do with the workflow yet. I don't think I really will do that in this session. But feel free to ask questions if you have some crazy ideas. I will say that Databricks workflows are really built around running things within the Databricks environment, right? And so it's not uncommon that there's other things that happen upstream. Maybe there's some sort of special replication process from SQL Server to Azure Storage, SQL Server to a Kafka environment or an Azure Event Hubs environment. You can use Databricks compute to do those types of things. And if so, I would recommend using Databricks workflows to orchestrate it. You can use Databricks compute. You could have a single node cluster that basically is just running Python code for a small piece of your job. You can orchestrate that with workflows easily. So anytime someone's like, can I call out to this REST API as part of a Databricks workflow? If you run it on a small Databricks cluster, any size Databricks cluster, yes, you can. You do need some kind of compute running to do it though. So that's kind of a good way to think about it. A lot of times with Azure Data Factory as an orchestrator, you have these different tasks that have their own kind of their runtimes, their integration runtimes that they run on. On Databricks, that's going to be like a cluster or a SQL warehouse that's going to run. Okay, I think that probably made sense for at least some of the people that have worked in Databricks a bit. It's okay if that was not super clear yet. It might help someone else though as they get into it. Do we have another question? Feel free.
Hi, Dustin. Yes, I do have another question. Now, you just touched on ADF. How do you say this will compare to ADF, the whole orchestration? How does Databricks workflows compare to that? Can you do pretty much everything in that you would do in ADF in terms of orchestration through the workflows?
I'm going to give you a very straightforward answer. You cannot do everything that you can do in ADF from Databricks workflows, and you can't do everything you can do from Databricks workflows from ADF. What you can do from ADF, for sure, from Azure Data Factory, is you could use the web API. Is that what's called the web activity to call the kickoff a Databricks workflow. And so when you have things that are happening in Databricks, especially if you can make these tasks related, and if there's small intermediate steps, run them from within the cluster that's going to be running anyway. I very much like having that built as a workflow within Databricks and then triggering that for that piece of your overall orchestration. Databricks as a platform can do a heck of a lot, which means it's very likely you could do everything you need to do for your, data pipelining ETL within Databricks, and then workflows really probably covers that for you. But we won't get into, I wouldn't go feature by feature saying, yeah, it's going to cover everything Azure Data Factory does.
The norm that I've seen is they use ADF, and then they through those pipelines they have notebooks called out, and then it does a bunch of works and ETLs, and then it goes on and go for it.
All right, I'm gonna give you a pro tip because it's really important. It's not to bash anyone. It's really important. When you set up let's say you're looping through and running notebooks with the notebook activity, I think is probably what's called the Databricks notebook activity within Azure Data Factory. If you're choosing a job cluster to have that lower price job compute, last I checked at least, it's going to spin up a different job cluster per call. Whereas, as I tried to call out to hint at this already, with Databricks workflows, I can share that job cluster across multiple tasks within the workflow. Something that very good. So I'd say I would look at how do I do that within Databricks is I guess where I'm going with that.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about Databricks asset bundles. I'm going to give you the long version, semi-long. It's not going to be too long, don't worry. Long version of this in a second. Since I didn't give you my shortcut summary slide, let me just say it, which is Databricks asset bundles is really a way to take the work that we're doing that needs deployed, needs managed through version control, and give us a way to automate that. That's easier than writing code to work with the REST API or writing Terraform code. Now, if you write Terraform code every day, you probably go, well, how could it be easier? And I don't have an answer for you. But if you don't write Terraform code very much and you're a data engineer, and let's say hypothetically I got put on a project where I had to suddenly manage Terraform stuff every time we wanted to change a workflow, there's pain that you feel as a data engineer if you're not working with Terraform all the time. And so this is meant to simplify that for those that need it simplified. And there's no shame in using a simpler option. It's actually very smart as a developer to do that. So as we talk about why this fits in, let me call out that there's a link at the end of this on kind of my resources slide to the Data and AI Summit talk from 2023, where Rafi and I think Rafi and Peter talked about this kind of newly released Databricks asset bundles. And so I'm borrowing Rafi's slides for this because they're very good and very helpful. I don't want to recreate them when his are great. So essentially, we've got the idea of a project within Databricks is going to have code. We've talked about notebooks or Python or Scala, and Scala packaged up Scala code that's not a notebook would be in some kind of jar format, etc. We have an execution environment, which is going to be our Databricks workspace and the clusters that we're running on or the SQL warehouse that we're going to run on. We have other resources like the workflow itself, which is really how we automate those notebooks and code into some kind of scheduled or triggered thing. Okay. We also need to produce a variety of data products like tables, reports, dashboards, etc. And then the task determines the components. So essentially, we might have different components needed depending on what it is we're trying to do. And these components work together to actually give us a meaningful, valuable thing. So the idea of Databricks asset bundles is write the code once and then deploy it everywhere. So don't be stuck writing the code in production. We do not recommend that. We typically, our best practice, the Databricks best practice that you'll hear is to separate production into its own Databricks workspace where it really is pretty isolated. You can share data still via unique catalog, but it's pretty isolated. That's not what you have to do, but that is kind of the best practice. So Databricks asset bundles, they are YAML files that will specify these artifacts and resources, the components that need to work together. We call these things bundles, and the bundle is the collection of components that's going to be deployed together, okay? And so you deploy them with the Databricks CLI. There's a newer Databricks CLI. It's been around a little bit now, but Databricks CLI 0.200 and above is what we're talking about when we say you deploy it with the CLI. And then these bundles are very useful for the CI/CD process. They also can be quite useful during development. And let's probably see that part in action rather than me explain it now. So then, as we look at an example bundle, this bundle is defining really everything for a very small deployment, just a single job, all within a single file, right? And so we've got the bundle and bundle name and workspace at the top. Those are just, you just need those there. We've got the set of resources, which can be a collection of mini jobs. Could be some other types of resources, but jobs is a very important one to know. And then we have the different environments. Development is going to be deployed with some different information, some different settings than production, and then staging. Okay, so we can define some things that are going to get swapped depending on which environment we're in. They made this slide really great. I forgot they had all this wonderful stuff there. Okay, I already explained it though. All right, so now we're going to jump into take a look at Databricks asset bundles. I think kind of a short-ish version of this so that we can also focus on testing, because I'm not sure how many here really feel that this testing is a super important part of this talk, but it is. And so I'm going to make sure we at least spend a good 5 minutes or so on it and can answer any questions you've got. So when we work with Databricks asset bundles, let's see. I was planning, let's try this real quick. Let me pull this up with VS Code if I can. If not, we'll go take a look at this in the browser. Give me 1 second here. Okay, we'll do it in the browser, sorry. So we can actually use this extension in Visual Studio Code that wasn't necessarily a big part of this talk, but I do like to talk about when I can, and work with this all from Visual Studio Code on our machine. Let me just browse through what we've actually got in our code so that you get the ideas that are important here. So when I work with Databricks asset bundles, at some point there's going to be, it used to be called bundles.yaml. Now it's typically called Databricks.yaml. And so I've got a monorepo setup. By monorepo, I mean I've got some set of shared like README and configs and things. And then I've got a separate folder per project. When I talk about a project, I'm talking in terms of what we just defined a Databricks project as, which is a set of things that need to be deployed together that are going to depend on each other. Usually there's some amount of the same team or a small set of teams owns that project. And so if we look at a simple project, hopefully it's not overly simple, but hopefully it's simple enough to give us a good set of stuff to talk about here. There we go. I've got my Databricks.yaml right here in this project. Because I've got multiple projects, I've got additional Databricks.yaml in other project folders, okay? So looking at this, it's going to really look a lot like what we just showed on the slide, which is intentional. My targets, I've got a few extra settings here, not too different. The main thing to call out though, if you do want to go and work with this code, is that you can use some built-in variables to set, you know, the specific path. And I use these a lot in setting the name of the resources I'll create. And if you want to make sure the run as user is whoever deployed it, which may or may not be what you need to do, but for CICD, it tends to work out okay. You can actually have a system variable define the username. Okay. But there's not nearly as much in this as in the example I showed on the slide. And that's because what I've done is I'm including the different resources I need. And I've got them sort of broken out a little bit more modular. And they're all in this resources directory. So in my resources directory, I'm going to see more YAML, right? That's the syntax. It's this indented, very specific formatted code. I've got more YAML that's going to define resources, jobs, and then some number of jobs. I've got, I think, just one in this resource. So let's double check here. just one job here, which is a typical way I design these, but you could have multiple jobs under this jobs section. So we can set our schedule here. We can set our email notifications. Let me make sure I've got this thing before I do it. Give me a moment to make sure what I'm about to paste is actually what I want to paste before I put it on the screen you all can see. And then we can essentially look at what it looks like to add a new job. All right, come on, right there. Cool, that's it. So if I wanted to add a new job here, which I wouldn't normally do right here in this browser, but GitHub's awesome and lets me do that if I decide to. I get, let's hope that's about the same indentation level. Really, I'd probably, if I had to, jump to the Databricks UI instead. And then I'm defining my job based on, this would need to go elsewhere. Oh, that was it. So I can basically paste in my job definition here from what I grabbed from the YAML in the environment. And so I think I'm missing just a job name, and everything else I just have to get the indentation matched up and we're in good shape. All right, excuse me one moment here. Okay, sorry, hope I muted in time for me coughing. Any questions? Okay, so that last thing I showed was really just to indicate, oh yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I understand. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so just one confusion, like, do we need to configure the YML file every time, or just in the beginning you have shown us the screen where we can configure the job name and everything? So, or is this the first time thing that we need to do?
Adding a brand new job, which is what I was trying to show there, then I need to configure it in the YAML file, yes. And so this is where I was taking the YAML I copied out of the Databricks UI and adding it here. And then I would make sure that I add some things that are a bit more dynamic, like possibly the cluster size would change, the bundle target would probably be part of the name, that kind of thing. Once that that workflow is defined here, I can usually take, and honestly, you can do this with a job if you want to, but I can usually take some of the tasks that I've already defined, copy and paste those and tweak them if I want to keep adding different tasks to the YAML. And that's what I typically do is I start with either there's some default examples that you can create via Databricks bundle init, or I take examples I've already done and I'll kind of tweak those just in the YAML itself. Okay. But I do like to show that, hey, if you're used to using the UI, you can still get most of what you need straight from the UI and add that in rather than have to go build all of it right here.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So with all this, I could from my local machine run a Databricks bundle deploy right from there. And that Databricks bundle deploy, if I have the right code on here, that Databricks bundle deploy would end up deploying all of this code to whatever my default environment was. In this case, and in most cases, your default environment will be marked as dev, and we would have the mode set to development, which means it's going to append this special naming in the front of it, which is going to be dev space my username. That way I know which stuff's mine versus another developer on my team that also chose to deploy to dev from their local workspace or from wherever they're working with dabs from. One of the things that is coming along is the ability to work with dabs even more within the Databricks UI itself. And so that's something to keep an eye out for. Again, Databricks Data and AI Summit's a great place to kind of hear the latest and greatest on these types of things. With that, there's a lot more I kind of want to say about this, but I think we probably should continue forward. And as things come up, I'll try to call them out, okay? So we haven't talked about testing yet. Let's kind of get into those slides and then we'll see what we can run from this UI for my testing. Real quick housekeeping. Let me see if I still have a cluster running. I do. I must leave this thing on quite a bit. That's okay. Okay, we'll come back to it then.
Dustin,
Go ahead.
I have a very quick question. Now,
Mhm.
in essence, of Databricks asset bundle is it basically a script to set up an environment?
A Databricks asset bundle is a definition of the resources and artifacts that need to be deployed into that environment. Yeah, so the environment in a bundle is really saying this is the Databricks workspace and the like sort of hidden directory that we want to deploy this version to. And we're going to take all of that, deploy it together out to your Databricks workspace. So an environment in your bundle defines different workspaces or different locations within a workspace.
Oh, as in you can deploy the newer version of, let's say, your notebooks, your workflows and everything, and jobs and so on and so forth.
Yep. And then the piece that
correct?
actually does the deploy is the Databricks bundle commands that are part of the Databricks CLI. So a very core part of Databricks asset bundles is that we can actually run commands that deploy these things. But I'd say the bundle itself, I think of as like the definition of all these things that need deployed.
Sorry, I'm trying to draw parallels with I work in the Microsoft stack, so the parallel to this is basically the pipelines, the deployment pipelines, release pipelines. Sorry.
So
if you're familiar with
when
those.
you look at like what we're going to see in a moment is essentially a build pipeline, build and release pipeline that I've done with GitHub Actions that runs Databricks bundle deployment as one step within that pipeline. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Okay.
So I'm going to do some Python stuff. I'm going to do some testing, and then I'm going to say, all right, I'm ready to deploy this stuff. Boom, Databricks bundle commands going to get me all that stuff deployed to my Databricks workspace.
Okay, thanks.
Which is why I say it's pretty portable to use this from, Azure DevOps versus GitHub Actions. Okay, sorry, I jumped the gun there. Let's talk about testing and automation, and we're going to kind of ease into GitHub Action, not ease in. We're going to jump into GitHub Actions really quickly here so that we can tie this all together into not so much how do I use testing as I develop, but how do I automate this for my deployments. So when we talk about testing, there's unit test. Your definition may vary a little bit. I'd be happy to, sit there and argue it, some other time. But for now, this is my definition, just so we're on the same page. Unit test is like your core business logic with Spark code, things that are running your data pipelines. Often that's any user-defined functions you have, or more often just like different functions you use that take in a data frame. Spark data frame being like your object of data in memory. Do some kind of transformation and return a data frame. And so my unit test is going to create a sample data set in Spark, a sample Spark data frame, pass it into this transformation function, and then validate that that transformation function returns something that matches my expectations. So I usually can do a lot of unit testing without really interacting with the file system, without interacting with my actual like catalog of tables and real data. I can use simulated data on the fly in my unit test. Unit tests will also include if I've got a bunch of configuration logic that's just reading files in, reading JSON and changing the dynamic nature of my code. All of that would be included here too, even if Spark's not involved at all. Okay. Integration test is when I start to get to like a full Spark notebook or a full, a larger piece of my application. So if one piece of my application is to clean and transform user data, which includes, looking up normalized addresses, etc., I might run that piece as an integration test that does all of that, even though that's still just one piece of my overall Databricks workflow. Okay, and so I'd kind of consider that an integration test. You could draw the lines a little bit smaller than that too, if you wanted. But often a Spark notebook, you'd want to do integration test over most of what's in a Spark notebook, or sometimes the full notebook kind of on its own. And then system test is for real, where I would say, let's run this full pipeline, this full set of related tasks with my sample data set with an environment that I think is meaningful for representing production. And so we may even have integration with other systems at this point. We're probably reading some things from a file system or from a Unity catalog table in order to make sure all of that's wired up correctly. We might even use autoloader a little bit on a sample data set instead of my real production data set, those types of things. Okay, so system tests are really important when it comes to confirming that staging is working well. And oftentimes I'll also run them on production if I can. If I can safely run them on production and keep them from interfering with any real workloads, I will do that as well with the system test. Unit test I'm running during development, and probably right when I think my code's ready to merge and go to staging, I run my unit test to make sure I didn't break anything. Questions or anyone strongly disagree and just has to say it before I ignore you and move on? All right, cool. We're gonna keep it on then. So feel free to put stuff in chat too, so I can catch it in a minute here when we have a moment. So when we look at PySpark testing, PySpark Spark 3.5, open source Apache Spark 3.5 has some PySpark testing built in. And so we can actually use these three types of testing to do assertions. And I'd say this is very handy if you've tried to use like default testing in Python to just compare a data frame. Little things are different about them that aren't really important when it comes to comparing them for test purposes, right? Like maybe one's nullable columns, one's not nullable, and that would often fail if you don't have the right special utilities to use. So I recommend looking into these if you're working in Databricks or in an environment where you can be on Spark 3.5. And Databricks, that means it's a Databricks runtime of 13.3 or above. I think they work a little bit better when you get to 14 and above, though I can't remember why that is, and they might have already kind of backported that. So as we get into, let's say I'm not on Spark 3.5, or I'm using something already because we've been doing this for a while, and I want Dustin to tell me that it's okay to use. So I will say here's a few that the Databricks team has shared with me, and I've used a couple of these before. So Chispa is one written by Matthew Powers, who's big contributor in open source, lots of really good libraries out there, and he's a Databricks employee as well now. He also, or I think Spark Fast Test was also something he created, though you'd have to double check that one. So Chispa is a way in Python to do very similar things to what I just showed you, plus it has some additional functionality that's not in open source Spark yet. Not sure if it's coming, but it's not there yet. As far as I understand, it's a little bit different in how it works. Spark testing base, if you're using Scala, apparently that helps with Python also, though I don't think I've used it with Python. I've used it with Scala for sure. Spark Fast Test and PyTest Spark are other ones that are recommended. But again, my recommendation, if you can be on 3.5 or above, try using these first. If you feel like they're not all the way there, see what's coming. You can usually find out what's coming to Apache Spark open source somewhat easily if you go digging a little bit. But if it doesn't have everything you need, then check out these other libraries. Okay, that's really the prepared slides on testing. I see I have a question. Go ahead. I think there's only one hand raised. Go ahead with your question, please.
Yes, I have a question. How do you do testing on, let's say, autoloader right now? I haven't done any tests on autoloader and the full process in terms of system tests. Do you have any example on how you would manage that?
I have an example somewhere, but it's not that exciting. So what I made sure, because I got this question recently, and I was like, it doesn't sound that hard, right? So maybe you'll have a reason that this is hard. But essentially, first off, I'll remind you something that I had to be reminded early on in testing, which is I don't necessarily need to test that every capability of autoloader works the way it says it does. Like, that's not my code. That should work just fine. So if I skip the autoloader step all the way until maybe that final system test where I need to just make sure I got the right configs, cool. So when I get to that final system test, what I would have then is, I believe I did it kind of as a parameterized notebook or job that's pointing to a different location. So it's the same autoloader code, same formatted file. And then I would have a little bit of a generation script, which I believe for me was like create a Spark data frame just off a list in Python. So something really simple. You may have to get more complex to match your production data a little better, but create a new batch of data and write it to a location in your ADLS or whatever cloud storage you're using, and have your test run pointing to that sample location. And then any kind of dynamic parameterization you need in that code in order for that to work has to be there for that to work. But typically what I see is that we've got that type of parameterization anyway if we're doing this deployment to staging and deployment to production differently. So you essentially run
Okay.
autoloader with the same configs, just off of a different location, where you're forcing the generation of the data right before you run it.
So your
Is that
system
reasonable? Do you see
test,
the problem there?
so your system test would be running the job and make sure that it works, right? At the end of the day.
Yes, that's a
Okay.
really good point. That's a great way to say it, actually.
Okay.
And so let me
Thanks.
show you. I'll show you the image of that too in a moment. But yes, that's essentially it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. You're welcome. Is it Chakshu? Are you next? Go ahead.
Yeah. So just a basic question, like, so is it possible to perform the backend, or the front end testing as well? I mean, on the basis of the system testing, that's why I'm got confused. Like, is it the
Give me an
entire
example.
system?
So when I say system testing, I basically mean a deployed state where it's actually interacting with other components and it's not isolated to just your code. So it's interacting with cloud
Okay.
storage. It might be interacting with Key Vault in some way, interacting with an API, maybe like a staging version of API or some test API. So in that sense, when I say system, actually end-to-end test is what I use most often. I forgot to put both names in there because I like to interchange them, unfortunately. That's just what I do, though. End-to-end testing is what
So
I'm thinking of.
Got it. So it has
Okay.
the capability of UI path testing and RPA testing, right?
Can you repeat that?
So it has the capability of UI path testing and the RPA testing that we do in the automation side.
So I don't know. I think I heard UI testing. I don't think so there's actually no special feature for system testing that I'm talking about right now. I'm just saying, as we look at the types of tests we need, system testing is one of them. I would not mess with the UI, but I'm a data engineer. So like, when people ask me, hey, how do I do this UI test? I go, oh, I've worked with some really good people. Ask them. I have no idea. And then I don't think you need to. It only has to be the full end-to-end thing. But essentially what you're saying is, can I trigger a workflow that would happen somehow? If it's triggered via some click on a UI that runs some kind of REST API call, just trigger that REST API directly from your deployment and pull and wait for it to complete and then check the results at the end. I'm going to show you a clear example of this, though. It's kind of in the middle of integration and system test, but it is very much backend. It's very much on my data pipelines and my analytics data processing. It's not trying to cover any kind of UIs we built on the front end.
Got it. And the last thing, I just want to ask, like, is it similar to like the pipeline we create in the SSIS packages, like in Microsoft SQL Server, that we have SSIS packages?
A workflow would be similar to a single file within your SSIS code base. Yeah, a workflow would be similar to SSIS. I would say it's closer to, the more I say that, I don't like that. It's not the same. It's more like whatever you're using to orchestrate code. And so the code itself is the notebooks or the scripts or the jar files. The workflow is the orchestration of that. So it's going to kick off a notebook, kick off a script. It's going to define where that needs to run, what compute that needs to run on. It does not do like UI-based data transformations and things, right? So if you were to use SSIS or Data Factory to just orchestrate a bunch of SQL statements, it's kind of like that, but for way more than SQL statements, for Python code, Java code, full, large processes that are going to be running distributed on Databricks. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, I kind of backtracked because SSIS had a lot of really like UI-driven ETL, and it's not that really.
Yes.
It's UI-driven orchestration, which I'm then showing you how to define in YAML so you can automate it and you're not stuck only with the UI.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Calvin, is it quick? We need to keep going, but go ahead if it's a quick one. If you still have one.
Sorry, I forgot to put it down.
All right, let's get into this, and then I'll kind of do a time check pretty soon here as I get back into demo mode. So GitHub Actions. We'll see this in a moment, but basically the GitHub action, you set up a workflow that is going to be the scripting that'll handle the CI and CD for the project. In this case, I'm going to have a separate action, a separate workflow per bundle. I'm just going to say GitHub action because I'm already talking about Databricks workflows and it gets confusing if I interchange those terms. So with my GitHub action, I'm defining how to like build and package if needed and deploy this stuff and test it automated. For my monorepo example, I just said this, I'd have a separate action per bundle per project. If my repo is one single deployment, then I'd have one single bundle and I do it all in one single GitHub action. It might be really big depending on how much code there is, but that's the idea. I would want to run unit and integration tests within that action to make sure that it's happening every time code gets merged before it gets deployed. And then here's where you would use dabs to Databricks asset bundles. I shortened it to dabs if you didn't catch that earlier. Now you know. We would deploy our dabs work and we would be able to kick off any validation workflows, which is exactly what I think it was Calvin kind of summarized, is that a validation workflow takes real code or close to real code, maybe parameterized a bit for testing, and runs it with some sort of validation step included. So let's go to demo. And then why don't I, before I do that, please don't go watch the amazing presentation on dabs quite yet. I highly encourage it later. Let me see, can I do this from presentation mode? Okay, we'll get there. Please remind me to share these links as we're getting into Q&A time very shortly. Also, I do have like an intro to dabs. It's a little bit older now, but it still kind of covers a little bit more hands-on of this. I have that on YouTube if you want more demo, more dabs specific talk. And then follow me on LinkedIn to hear more about other things that I share about. So we might come back to that slide, we may not. So let's get into demo mode and make sure we cover what I want to cover here. So we'll get to the test after I show you how we use GitHub Actions to run the test and run the Databricks deploy. Can you believe it? My staging GitHub action has actually worked live in a demo. That's quite impressive, I'll tell you that. I've done this a lot and seen red most of the time. So, and the reason being, if you haven't done a lot of DevOps, is we do these little changes and we change like, I actually do interact with a database table in my validation script. It's more of an E2E test, like I said. And so we change environments, we delete stuff, we change permissions, and then we go and deploy this automated test into the system. And we've changed something somewhere that we, I've been tweaking this code for like a month or two probably since I last ran that action on that exact setting. So, so that's good. And my CICD is working well, which is amazing. What I did earlier is I merged into main. That's how that, remember I did this pull request, I did approve, I did something called squash and merge. So now that it's in main, I can go check out the actions and see what I'm so excited about, which is that my merge to main kicked off my staging deploy and it ran the bundle piece, which this is, I made this name up, deploy bundle. I might have taken it from the defaults, but this is a very Databricks way of saying this. You could call this whatever you need to. And then I have my run pipeline update. In this case, it's really running a validation test. So let's look at, I think what I'm going to do, because I'm realizing I'm way better at using the Databricks UI than I am at using the GitHub UI, is I'm going to go back to my repository that we worked with earlier. And instead of trying to get VS Code shared the way I meant to have it ready before I just switch machines, we're going to look at it right here. So my GitHub workflows, so in other words, the GitHub action definition is right here. We're looking at staging, so let's look at dev first. We'll do this quick, don't worry. So when I look at dev, I've got some setup stuff. If you're used to using Azure DevOps, this probably looks similar even though the exact terms are different. It's YAML that defines some steps that somehow exist out there and that this GitHub action is going to understand for me. I'm going to switch to that simple project directory. So I'm only working with one single project within my mono repo. That's why I've named this one simple project. I would have a complex project as well. I'm going to do some steps. Check it out. Set up Python. There might be better ways, but this is a way that I stumbled upon to basically do some installation of components and install the requirements I need to run my test right there on this GitHub runner. When I say GitHub runner, I believe that's the actual name. I could be messing it up. That's like this machine that's running my CI, and actually in this case, my CI and my CD, my build and my release. So on this local machine, I'm running Python. or this, machine that's out there in GitHub world. And I'm going to kick off my Python test. I'm doing something that I normally talk about and don't, because we spent so much time on workflows, because that's what I wanted to do. I didn't talk about Databricks Connect, which is a way for me to, from my local environment or any non-Databricks, non-Spark environment, I can use Databricks Connect to actually run my Spark commands against a Databricks cluster. So I've got this secret variable set, which gives it all the connection it needs to go and run my test on that compute that's running on the other screen there. So it's going to kick off this stuff. It's going to run some of it locally on the GitHub runner. It's going to kick off some of it against the Databricks cluster. It's doing all of that because I've configured this for Databricks Connect. You could also skip this piece and build all of the tests you want into some kind of workflow that you use Databricks bundle run for, okay? All right, so we do some setup of the Databricks CLI, which is required to use Databricks bundles. Then I do Databricks bundle deploy. This is my default environment, which was dev, so I don't have to add a lot more extra stuff to it. And it needs a Databricks token, which I've saved, and there's a way to save secrets for your GitHub actions. So this is where I deployed. I could run the same thing from my local machine, authenticated as myself there. Does that make sense? Any questions on the Databricks bundle deploy? Okay, great. I think that means you're tracking. It might mean you don't like this part, and that's okay, because we're going to move on to testing from the workspace in just a second. Next, we do the next set of steps, which I named run pipeline update. We're going to make sure we're in the right working directory, make sure the prior step has completed is all that that's doing, check out, set up CLI, and then here's where I've got running on my CLI, I've got code, which is the important part is this. The important part is instead of Databricks bundle deploy, it's Databricks bundle run, and then it's using a specific job name, a job ID that was in my bundle. And more important than that, just knowing that this is a name that I defined in my bundle itself, I'm going to show you what that job does, which gets into the testing side. So we would have seen one. This one is using dev, and if you're really tracking, you know that the dev one would have this this special syntax on the start, dev training. Training is my username, by the way, because I'm not very creative. And so that is my dev deployment that happened earlier today. We'll say it happened a long time ago, and I didn't just keep tweaking this up until we started. The other one, though, my staging one, doesn't have this special thing added on, but I made sure it's called staging because I have I use the bundle target special variable to give it that name. So right around 3:26 Pacific time, which is probably a few minutes after I did the merge, this thing kicked off. And what we have is we have an example of possibly an integration test because it's running a single notebook. If the single notebook really is my, my big pipeline that I care about, it's all kind of encapsulated there. We could say this is an end-to-end test or a system test. So I have a notebook which does setup. This is a really interesting topic that I'm not going to bore you with right now, but I'm not using a Git repo. I'm actually using the workspace location. And you might notice there's some things grayed out. There's some notifications here to tell me you deployed this through Databricks Asset Bundles. You really shouldn't be changing it right here. And then, I can say YOLO and just do disconnect from source and change it however I want. And just like any good CI/CD setup environment, eventually someone's going to deploy this the right way and override whatever changes I did. So don't do what I just did. I just wanted you to know in case you ever need to. So my setup notebook is actually pretty dumb in this case because this isn't a simple example, but it's going to drop all the data in some, well, I should have called, it's called dev. So it's kind of giving the hint that it's a test area. This isn't my real production catalog. And so it's going to clear out the table before everything runs. In reality, I'd probably generate some data right here. And next time you look at this code, perhaps I'll have done that because that's a better example than what I did. Set things up to run the test. And then the other piece, if I go back to here, is a notebook that we'll pretend has a bunch of really interesting logic for data transformation that my team's excited I built. In my case, it's going to use some relative imports for Python libraries that are also in this repository. or actually they're also deployed along with my notebook. The bundle deployment, Databricks bundle deployed my notebooks and my Python libraries that were all relative to this. I could package this up as wheels. If you're familiar with that, just know that you can totally do that. And sometimes I do in my examples. In this case, I just deployed it all to the same area in the workspace and let the relative paths import whatever I deployed last time I did my bundle deploy. So it imports this code, it runs a function, does a show, does some more Spark stuff, which isn't really the point of this topic. And so the reason I'd cleared out this table is that I'm going to write to this table in my test. So back to the point earlier, if this was a staging environment, maybe I do have like, maybe I have a hard-coded name that I use for staging and prod. No, I would need to switch this out. I'd probably switch catalog if I'm in stage and switch catalog if I'm in production. Perhaps I leave this as a hard-coded name and this as the same schema across different catalogs. Just to quickly explain that you might parameterize this all the way. You at least need to like switch catalogs or schemas or something as you go between environments. All right, finally, the last step that gets called is the validation notebook. Here's where we start to see code examples of using those built-in PySpark testing capabilities. So I'm grabbing assert data frame equals my favorite one because I've got a function that, oh no, in this one I'm really just trying to evaluate that what I think the result's going to be is what the result actually is. So in this case, I'm querying an actual table. This is not my normal case, but this is appropriate for integration test or end-to-end test validation, where I've literally written to a table in my catalog and I want to pull back some results and validate. Expected counts is basically recreating that logic in some way from the source data so I can make sure at the end I get the right counts. The reality of this is I probably would have a lot more transformations and special things happening in the processing. And so I'm really just validating things like row counts, maybe group by some like customer key and validate that. Does that make sense? You validate some things about it that give you confidence that this is doing what you want. You may not have an exact replicated data frame, which is why I'm grouping in things to aggregate up to a level that's actually meaningful to compare. And then a more simple assert is not using those cool functions. Instead, I'm just basically grabbing the results and comparing those to hard-coded results of counts and rows. So probably, yeah, so if this wasn't a sample data set, if I ever get clever with what I'm doing with my trip summary table that I do, one day this test will, this test up here will keep working because it's a little bit more dynamic and it looks at the table versus the source. This test down here is going to break because one day it won't be 60, it's going to be 62 because I added in a few random problems into my sample data just to make sure I'm handling them well, that sort of thing. So to tie this back together, there's a lot more I'd love to say about testing that I won't get into. Let's do some Q&A, but this is a validation flow. I do kick that off from my actual GitHub action, or you would do it from your Azure DevOps build pipeline, build and release pipeline, one of those two if you separate those. And that's pretty much it. It would return an error if it didn't work, and it returns some information to to my different steps, like some logging comes back that I can work with. Probably the best part of using the dabs run is that it waits for it to complete, so it doesn't just like run it and then I have to go check it on my own. And it gives me a link so I can go use the workflow modern UI, which lets me go through and click on a notebook and do things like take a look at what my show was in play, see how long each thing took to run. Pretty much get to the details I care about pretty easily, and also pretty easily jump to the Spark UI that was part of this run if I need to go deeper into why did this take 3 seconds or 30 seconds. All right, with that, I don't think I missed any huge topics that I meant to cover here. And I could talk all day about these examples, so why don't we just pause that there and say what questions are still out there for me?
I have a question. I see that you're working on a monorepo. Have you worked the other way around on project based for each repo, or how do you feel like so far you've been working with?
Yeah, so I switched this one to a mono repo because I don't know trends across all industries or anything like that. I kept getting asked, hey, what's this look like if it's a mono repo? And so I changed everything to have one because I have that question more often than the opposite. And so if I'm showing this example though, this isn't what you said, but it's quick. If I'm showing this example, someone's like, well, what if if everything's related and everything's part of the same project? Okay, your Databricks.yaml's right here. And your root
Yeah,
folder
right.
is
Yeah.
the root of the repository. And it's a little bit simpler and you don't change directory in your, deploys. Maybe your PyTest paths are a little bit simpler to work with than they are in this case. That's kind of it. Otherwise, it's the same idea. Yeah. Anyway, that's why
Okay.
a lot of people are asking about it.
Cool. Thank you. And do you build wheels on your current project template, or you're not building any wheels?
I do build a wheel.
Okay.
There's two questions I get asked. Let's just get them out there. One is, what if I have a wheel that's not that's like reused across, I don't know, let's say 10 different projects in my repo. I say, okay, well then don't use the cool built-in dabs capability in that case. Just build the wheel the old-fashioned way. Build the wheel as part of, like I would call this script as part of my GitHub action. Build the wheel, upload it to a workspace file or a volume on Databricks, not to DBFS. That location is not as secure. Workspace files and volumes are good. And then you can, what's this doing? This is uploading it to a workspace file. So get that on your workspace file, and then you can just call it a dependency when you're running your jobs. The other way to do it that is in here somewhere is going to, I'm not going to search for it right now, but it's going to build the wheel automatically as it's doing the deploy.
Okay.
And that's in the
Thank you.
documentation. They cover that pretty well in the docs. All right, is it Jubin?
Hi, yes. Sorry, I have a general question regarding data anonymization. Like, if you're going through testing, what would be your strategy for data anonymization?
I've had. All right, so I've been in a few. This is all pre-Databricks. This is like actual, as an employee or at times as a consultant. I've seen the cases where we actually either needed a really, really complex tool to handle the anonymization for us in order to properly test the data the way we would in production. And so we got the exception to probably, I'd say, the only cases I would say were at all reasonable is when we had like a staging environment where it was basically locked down the way production was, but we were dealing with production data in staging and just writing to a different location. I highly encourage putting in the effort trying to do the data anonymization that you can do. If you can do it in production as well, and just have, and have it anonymized across the board for most of your users, I think that's a great way to go. Otherwise, we have built our own utilities that will take a snippet of production data and use like Faker. I know Matthew Powers has some stuff that I've been meaning to try out, like build some similar types of fake data to help us kind of get a proper test. The place that always broke down is when I have multiple systems that need to join on some kind of privileged info, like not an SSN, thankfully, but like a customer ID might be, or a user ID might be, PII, depending on the scenario and how identifiable it is. And so those cases were a lot tougher, and you need either a really good tool, which there are some that you can buy. I don't know much about them, or you do some work to build those.
Okay, but not in the Databricks world, like basically in Delta, Delta tables where I'm going to be able to basically select the production data or portions of it and anonymize some of the data.
I would really want to have, if we can't have it anonymized in production, is that the scenario you're asking about?
Yes. I've come across projects where.
I would really want I really want a job that syncs that into a staging catalog where it does get anonymized in a way that still gives me really meaningful system tests. And part of the reason I still have system test in production is because of that. So I really want staging to look exactly like production, but privacy concerns, security concerns are real. They're important. And so sometimes that system test in production's a little bit more important because we know the data is not the same as what we've either anonymized or scrubbed or whatever you want to call it in staging. So you can totally do all that in Databricks, but it's not like there's some special Databricks tool that does it for you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I think we probably need to wrap here. Why don't I grab these links to put in there? And hopefully between the links and checking out my YouTube video and stuff, you'll have enough to keep you going. But definitely connect with me on LinkedIn and ask questions too if you still have them.
Hey, Dustin, this is Dipankar here. I'd like to thank you for your time. I'm sorry I was not able to join at the beginning, but thank you so much. It's a lot of things to go with. Can I ask a general question?
Yes.
It's related to, irrespective of Databricks or ADF or Snaps, whatever you use, do you create more than like one repo to manage different projects? Is that you generally do, or you can have like one repo still you can actually work on more than one projects?
I think many organizations will need more than one repo. I think it's very normal to need more than one repo because of the ability to run all the tests and make sure everything's good before you deploy. A lot of times things don't really need deployed together, and so having it all together is a problem. That being said, you simplify this process a lot if you have a lot of things in a single repo. So I usually start with what would it look like if it was one repository, and kind of break it out from there, right? We go, well, but then we have the data science team really shouldn't touch this code or even see this code. And they're like, well, then we need to break it out some way. So not a solid answer there. It's something that I do a little thinking on because there's some trade-offs.
No, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I can talk about my experience. I had to work on multiple projects where I don't want people to touch my different repository. So we had to build utilities that is working across all the different projects. So common libraries for Databricks or utils. So that's how we manage on my end and my different company that I worked on. So. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone. I
thank you.
think we are almost out of time. Thanks, Dipankar, for joining us. And thanks, Dustin, for an amazing session, for your time. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We truly appreciate it. Be alert on Meetup of our upcoming events. And today's session will be posted on our website and will be sent out as a notification on Meetup with the slides and the recordings with the links as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Everybody.